Hello and welcome to the continuing series Conversations in Risk Management and Corporate Governance, sponsored by Loyola University Chicago. My name is Don Schwartz and I'm the director of the Center for Integrated Risk Management and Corporate Governance. Today I'm pleased to welcome Betty Simkins. Betty is a Williams Company Professor of Management and Finance at Oklahoma State University. She is an author of a forthcoming book on enterprise risk management. She has written and lectured extensively on enterprise risk management, and she is the editor of the Journal of Applied Finance. Betty, it's so nice to have you here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Don.
Let me begin by getting your assessment of exactly what is enterprise risk management, or ERM, and what do you think are some of the conceptions and misconceptions?
Okay. Well, enterprise risk management, it's a fairly, risk management has evolved over time, and I view it as a new paradigm for risk management, managing risk across the firm. I mean, the term, it's a fairly young discipline, about 15 years old, and it's taking like financial risk, market risk, credit risk, legal risk, reputational risk, insurance risk, we could go on, but broadly viewed and integrating them throughout the company and involving the board of directors, aligning it with objectives of the company, and of course it has to be involved with corporate governance and corporate strategy, and that is critical for a company to employ enterprise risk management. All those players have to be involved, because like you mentioned, what are misconceptions? And one common misconception is I think a company may say we're doing enterprise risk management, but they're not really doing true enterprise risk management. They're not involving the board of directors enough. They're not linking it with strategies and risk objectives, and they're not viewing risk broadly. Some companies, and even John Fraser said this, and John is who I'm co-editing the book on enterprise risk management with, and he's with Hydro One, Chief Risk Officer, and John has said that he's noticed some companies say we're doing ERM, but they're not really. And why they're not really, let's say they're just looking at market and credit risk. Well, just looking at market and credit risk is not enterprise risk management. You have to look at all the others, because we could use AIG as an example. Reputational risk, the company's changing the name. The name's too tainted. I mean, that speaks excellent to the ultimate damage of reputational risk. So we can't ignore those, and so that's a misconception. And misconceptions, another one is one skill set's enough, and it's not. Whoever's going to play that role of the chief risk officer and implement the ERM has to be someone that can talk to a lot of people, can talk to a lot of backgrounds. You can't have a quantitative person that's narrowly focused in that function, because they can't communicate. You've got to be able to talk to just a wide variety of people. And so good chief risk officers are good with that. And they communicate, because if communication breaks down in a company, then all sorts of problems happen. And so they have to create transparency and then communicate that to the board.
In today's environment, what are some of the risks that you think companies should be focusing on or have not focused on?
Well, taking the subprime crisis, which is, is motivating many dissertations now, in the academia, and of course a lot of practitioner articles are being written. So taking that as a first example, it seemed like companies got, looking at the balance sheet, the asset side and the liability side, they started putting these subprime asset, on the asset side, and then had the liabilities, and not managing risk. It wasn't diversification, and of course we had a bubble, a real estate bubble, and history has numerous bubbles through time, and companies, I think, get caught up in making a lot of profits when we're going into that bubble, and they lose that. They have what I view as a style shift. You could call it strategy shift. And they start, originally they'd say, some of the mortgage origination companies said, we don't want to be in the subprime area countrywide through their history, and then they got into it and got more and more, and it was going well because they were in the beginning of the bubble, so everything looks great. And then it happens, so I feel like those are big mistakes. Style shifts, over leveraging to try to make more profits, and putting too much risk on both sides of the balance sheet. crucial to these companies. And I read an article where they say that, if you jump from a 100-foot building, the first 99 feet, you feel like you're flying.
It's the last foot.
It's that last foot. And there's analogies to this crisis that remind me of that everything was great. They were riding a bubble.
Well, let's focus on what you think are some of the myths about enterprise risk, because I think you have 2 or 3 things that you really believe are key. What are those?
Well, some companies say they're doing enterprise risk management, and they're not really. And it's not just me saying that. John Frazier, who I work with, who's the Chief Risk Officer at Hydro One, we've had a number of conversations, people he knows. And what makes it, so a myth is just because you say you're doing it, number one, you're not doing it. And you have to have the board of directors involved. The tone comes from the top. You have to have a risk champion that says, we're going to do this and get the whole company and culture around it. And John and I have written an article where we talk about 10 misconceptions on enterprise risk management. And a couple that I want to bring out is risk management. Enterprise risk management can add value. In fact, now the rating agencies, we've got Moody's, Standard & Poor's, that they include in their ratings process if a company has an enterprise risk management system in place. And it's not just for banking or insurance companies, which they've done that longer. They looked at their enterprise risk management practices. But now they've extended it to non-financials. And companies that have a good enterprise risk management system in place will receive a better credit rating. And how they have a series of questions. For example, Standard & Poor's, they have a series of questions they ask them to get at that. Is it really ERM? And they can, if you ask enough questions, you can really get a feel that, yes, it is embedded in the company's culture, the board of directors, the audit committees involved. There is a risk, chief risk officer or a risk executive or a finance executive managing it.
Okay, so the first point that I hear you making here is the whole idea of culture. So why has risk management failed or succeeded, and how has culture affected that?
Okay, well, some companies have abandoned enterprise risk management, and because I think it didn't get instilled in the culture. And here's an example. I think the consulting companies are very helpful. And Hydro One, originally they started with consulting company, but then the consultants left and the company went back to the way they did it. And that's before John was hired. Then they hired and brought him in to be a chief risk officer, and he ran risk workshops regularly. Started it. It's kind of like when you create a new product. You first start bench scale. And you may work out all the kinks on the bench scale, and then you do a pilot plant, bigger scale. And then eventually when you work all those kinks out, you come out in full-scale production. And that's what they have done at Hydro One. And the companies that abandoned it, I think, they hired consultants that came in, the consultants left, and they didn't really get it embedded in the culture. They didn't have a risk champion, somebody that was like the risk cheerleader, rah, 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 let's do this, and they have to keep everybody motivated. And John's certainly that at Hydro One, and I can think of other companies. Todd Perkins at Southern Company, a lot of examples of people that are really, they keep it going.
The whole idea of a champion. But let me step back for just a second. How do you measure the value of risk management? Obviously you have higher credit rating and lower cost of capital. But how do I say risk management made me or did this to the tune of so many $1 million? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, when you're saying that, you reminded me of a quote, a quote I heard Joe Reezy say. He's now with CapGen, but he used to be with a chief risk officer at Bank of America. And Joe said that there are no statues in the park for the person that prevented the risk. And that's a great analogy. I mean, how do you know? It's not like a field where you can put fertilizer on one plant and not fertilize the other and you can see them do better. With this, it's hard to judge, and the jury is still out on this over time as far as academic research, if it adds value, because I'm of course seeing it from an academic viewpoint. We can once we have a good time period and look at companies that had enterprise risk management, and then companies that don't, and do some sort of match sample, we can show kind of no statues in the park, because maybe the company that did have it and for a long period would have had fewer disasters than the other company.
So the fact that something didn't happen, how do you measure that?
Yeah, you really can't, and so here's how to get an answer to that question. We could say that their surveys have been done. I know of one working paper that Paul Walker's authoring. He has two co-authors, and they survey 150 risk officers, and they survey them about the perceived value of enterprise risk management. And what they found is that the companies did respond, that they felt it did make the company more valuable. It increased transparency within the company because risks are more communicated. It also improved decision making, and they said there is a perceived value that to ERM. And the reason I say perceived, because it's a survey. It's not like we can tie to stock returns over time. Now, getting back to the broader, just as risk management add value, there have been studies that have shown that. I've done a study on the airline industry that co-authored with Dave Carter and Dan Rogers, and we show that airlines that actively hedge fuel price risk have had higher, they're more valuable. And we use a metric called Tobin's Q, but you could think of it analogy as they have higher equity value. It can add 10 to 16% premium to it that actively manage it. And we found that those airlines that actively hedged over a long period, and we look at 10 plus years, that they're more likely to be able to make investments at strategic times. Like a great time to make an investment is when the industry has a downturn. And the airline industry is known to have distress sales. And everybody likes to shop on sale. I love to go 75% off. I love that. Well, it's the same thing in industry. When you like to go buy assets when everything's 75% off. And so in that case, by managing risk, you can be a key player in a downtime. I mean, this is a great time to be expanding operations if you're in the financial institutions area.
Well, let me pose this. You said credit rating agencies are looking at companies. What makes you believe that credit rating agencies can assess anything other than credit risk? And secondly, how does an investor, how can they assess the effectiveness of a company's risk management?
Oh, good. Tough questions. Yeah. The credit rating agency's expertise is in the area of credit, focusing more on the financials and anything that may affect paying back debt, and then looking at equities because and economic situations. I think kind of getting into that question, that may be part of their motivation to start incorporating enterprise risk management and governance. They actively look at governance practices too. And I think it can help them kind of glean those other areas of non-credit risk that eventually will be a credit risk, like reputational. I mean, I could tell you I've got a lot of interesting stories about reputational risk where companies weren't looking at that, but then it ultimately came down to credit. When the disaster happened, the reputation was tarnished, lost sales, financial distress. But I do think that rating ERM is one way for them to do that, and of course corporate governance, because if you've got a good corporate governance structure, good board of directors, the company is going to be without a doubt better managed, and so other non-credit risk will hopefully you have more transparency.
Well, let's pick up on the idea of corporate governance. What should be the role, and what role should corporate boards not play in terms of risk management?
Well, I think the board of directors and the CEO and the chairman of the board, they should help set the company's strategy and their risk tolerances and the objectives and focus on that. This is our strategy. These are the risks that we can tolerate, and these are our business objectives. And then using that as this is who we are and what we want to do, then establish an ERM program that helps you achieve those objectives. And I think it's crucial that if it's a chief risk officer or whoever runs the ERM program, that they report to the board twice a year. I think twice a year is definitely, I think, frequent enough. I know that John Frazier reports to the board twice a year of their risk objectives and any sort of risk trends, and they generate risk maps and risk tolerances, and they focus, everything is tied back to those objectives. Are we meeting our objectives? And is there a new risk emerging that is going to hurt our objective?
One of the things that strikes me is, what makes you believe that corporate boards have the requisite expertise to assess risk? And secondly, why should corporate boards rely on the very management who's generating the risk to provide them the direction, information, and input?
Okay, so, well, the board of directors is going to be dependent on the information that's given to them from senior management and like the chief risk officer. And as far as, I think the structure of the board would be crucial, that you need to have experts in key areas. And of course, if a company that has a lot of, let's say, technology risk, you would want to have a director that is an expert on technology in a related area, and so that they can proceed, they would understand that marketplace. And of course, if you have a company with a lot of market and credit risk, you would want to have people on the board with strong financial backgrounds, so that when the risks are reported, they really do have an understanding. And they need to be outsiders and independent, the majority of the board of director members. And of course, I do think corporate governance is improving a lot. In the 90s, starting in the 1990s, it seems like there was just a lot of problems and criticisms, and academic research is just explosive in this area. At the upcoming Financial Management Association meeting international, there are 32 sessions, and we're talking sessions with 3 papers in each session, 32 at the annual meeting on corporate governance. And because I'm involved in the FMA, that organization, but that just speaks to how much people are looking at that now.
Can you give me an example where boards have done a really good job in terms of their risk supervision?
Okay, where boards have, when you ask that question, I can think of a lot of counter examples, so let's think of a good example. Well, I think, using John's company, Hydro One, I think they do an excellent job. And I'm big fans of companies like Williams Companies, where I hold the professorship, or the one that they've endowed the chair. I actually worked for Williams in the past, and they're a company that have had a lot of financial problems through the years, and they have made it. They didn't file bankruptcy, and I do think that they have a strong board of directors, and they do have an enterprise risk management system in place. But I do think they're a company that learned from their mistakes. They've made mistakes, and they'll admit to them.
So one of the things you need: board structure, you need board expertise, and you need an assertive board.
Yes. Yeah.
We've come through a very difficult period, and given your expertise in risk management, what are some of the prescriptions that you would offer or recommend to people in terms of managing and controlling risk going forward?
Okay. Well, and here's one that keeps popping up, and I think that compensation needs to be restructured, because greed will be there always. It's embedded in our persona, and psychologists would say it's so taking the grant that people are motivated by money. They need to restructure the compensation so that like bonuses are paid out over multiple years, not just in 1 year, but paid out based on what you do now, but so that like in 2 or 3 years, when we know if this decision was ultimately good or bad, that the person making that decision has a stake in that payoff too. Because now you get bonuses, you could make a very bad decision, but using mark-to-market accounting or the different methods, you may say, well, this has a great net present value right now, but you haven't realized those cash flows. And a lot of this was going on with the various companies caught up in the subprime crisis, and they walk away. And when we could think of the mortgage originators, the loan brokers, they had no stake in the game.
So compensation is one. How about 2 more?
Oh, okay. So compensation and could you kind of repeat that question again?
Well,
I want to think more broadly about that.
In terms of the prescriptions that you would recommend or suggest to companies, what are 2 or 3 things that you think they should adopt or pursue in terms of risk management? And one that you've mentioned is rebalancing the compensation scheme. What are a couple of others that you think are critically important?
Well, one thing is for companies to have an enterprise risk management system in place. I view that as best practices now in risk management. It's an evolving paradigm. James Lamb coined the word enterprise risk management in the early 1990s. So it's fairly new. I mean, we're talking 15 years roughly, 15, 16 years. Before that, the name didn't exist. And as risk management is involved, enterprise risk management, in my opinion, is a best practices. So I think that's crucial.
So best practices.
Yeah, so if a company wants to do the best practices, you implement an enterprise risk management system and seriously do it, not in name only. And that means having someone be a chief risk officer and be accountable. It may be, depending on the size of the company, it may be somebody that wears 2 hats. I mean, John is also vice president of internal audit, and I've gone to his office and he has 2 hats, 2 caps. One says chief risk officer and the other VP internal audit. And
well, that actually hits on a very important point, and one that we've discussed is that people see risk through a very narrow lens. And maybe you want to comment a little bit about that as well.
Yes, like a holistic viewpoint. I think companies, whoever's in the key risk positions, needs to be able to see outside the box, have a broad view of risk and be able to communicate with a lot of people. Like, for example, John and I, in one article, we talk about the Tower of Babel, meaning people babble, and you've got different risk languages being spoken, and some people don't communicate. And, not to pick on the quants, but I've met a lot of quants, and they have a very narrow view of the world, and they're very brilliant in that area, but it's hard for them to see outside of that area, and that's fine. They're expert at what they do, but the person having the oversight needs to look more broadly because, doing the quantitative analysis, sometimes it's hard for them to step out and see the big picture. Like the over-reliance on value at risk. I mean, value at risk is a good measure. I mean, it's the best thing we have right now, in my opinion. And so it's coming on a lot of criticism, but my comeback is, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, it is a good tool, and it's the best thing that we've got right now. We need more tools, and we need to improve, and you can use VAR, but realize that VAR is limited. In fact, if you have a 5% bar that says we have a 5% chance of losses of 100 million, view that number as if we go into that 5% category, it's 100 million or more in losses. It's just the lower end of it. Looking at it from a different viewpoint, because before they would say, oh, the worst case is 100 million. No, not really. It starts there and it can get a lot uglier.
Just to clarify things, VAR is value at risk, and it's a technique that we practice, particularly in finance land. Let me conclude, if I can, with what do you think should be the role of universities in terms of risk management education and risk management research going forward?
Yes, that's one of my favorite areas. I'm teaching a course, or in March I taught a course at Trinity College Dublin in a Master's of Finance program on enterprise risk management, and so it isn't a Master's of Finance program, but part of my training I tried to get people that are more quantitative in nature to think broadly of reputational risk, legal risk. And so it's very important for educators, the universities, to, when they're teaching this concept of risk management and enterprise risk management, to broaden the perspective, because we in universities put everything in silos too. I mean, we criticize the corporate world sometimes by looking at risk in different little buckets. We got market risk, here's credit risk, here's legal risk, here's insurance risk, and not integrating. Well, the nature of the university, it's the same way. But I see like your center doing an excellent job of looking at broad risk. You've got ethics, you've got governance, you've got risk management, and legal, all multidisciplinary. So I think that's key to successfully do this within a university, to integrate it throughout, outside of the business school. Get the law school involved. At the university has a law school. North Carolina State University has an active ERM program, and I think they've been quite successful. And I think bringing executives in, like you're doing at your school, is key to speak and run conferences and get think workshops going, think tanks.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned ethics. How can you teach or implement ethics in risk management. You know, this is sort of a very nebulous concept.
Yeah. Well, I think, and, you know, this is something, I had conversation with some colleagues, and some of them have said that they think that, you know, by the time you reach somebody in a university and they're an adult, part of their ethics are already set. And so here's where I think it can really help. I mean, if somebody is inherently bound and determined to maybe, let's say they're very motivated by money and they'll do anything they want to be wealthy, you can't, I think it'd be very difficult to change that person. And let's say they have a narcissistic personality or something like that. But let's say the person in the middle, that maybe they get in an unethical situation and they don't know what to do. And to train them and talk about these are unethical things to do or unethical situations, and here's what you should do. Because I've actually had students contact me. I've discussed ethics in classes from time to time. I don't do it every semester, I'll admit that. But I have actually had students that have gone to work afterward, and one of them told me about they saw some fraud going on, but they were entry level and they didn't know what to do. This is after Enron. And we talked about it and then agreed. It wasn't major fraud. It wasn't to the point where you'd alert the SEC, but we ultimately thought that he left the company. He didn't think what he could do anything, and he sometimes that you walk away, because if he would have stayed, ultimately, if he could have been held accountable. He wasn't doing it, but you know, you kind of get caught up in it. And so I guess teaching ethics so that if people get caught in an unethical situation.
Well, one of the things that you've done today, Betty, and I thank you for being with us, is that you've sketched out a very broad view of risk: behavioral risk, governance risk, reputational risk. And I think that we as universities have a key role to play in terms of educating our students, as well as providing conferences and programs. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and sharing with us your views. Thank you so much, Betty.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.